Celeste Headlee. We Need to Talk. How to Have Conversations That Matter. Narrated by Alex Vincent and Thomas Florio.
We all talk. About, to, over, sometimes even with other people. Thanks to modern technology, we're more connected than ever before. But what sorts of conversation are we having? Not good ones. Even as it's become easier to stay in touch, the quality of our chat has declined. We are losing the ability to connect with other people. We are less empathetic. We listen less. In a way, it's understandable. Good conversation isn't easy. In these blinks, you'll see why it's worth putting in the effort and discover how you can truly get to know other people through talking.
Blink 1 of 7.
If you were to stand a human next to, say, a snow leopard or a Komodo dragon, you might wonder how we became the dominant species. There are all kinds of animals out there that are faster, bigger, and stronger than we are. Even some whose teeth are filled with poison. Yet, somehow, humans have risen to the top. One reason is our ability to communicate. What we lack in physical prowess, we make up for in being able to talk to each other in minute detail, and to listen, too. That has all manner of evolutionary advantages. It's strange, then, that we don't try a bit harder when it comes to communicating. In fact, these days, we're getting worse and worse at it.
The key message here is, good communication is fundamental to being human, but modern life has set us up with some bad habits.
People have been talking to each other since the dawn of time, but here's a very modern example that shows why learning to do it well is worth it. Poor communication costs money. For large businesses in the US and UK, the impact could be as much as $37 billion a year, according to a report from 2008. It's not just financial, and it's not just businesses that are affected either. Another study found that college students in 2010 were 40% less empathetic than students from 30 years earlier. A big contributor to this is undoubtedly the rise of technology and social media, which encourages fleeting superficial connection, not empathy. In another study, researchers put multiple pairs of strangers in a room together and asked them to chat. In half of the rooms, they also put a cell phone on the table. And even though the phone was just sitting there, it had a negative impact on the couple's communication. The pairs in the rooms with no cell phone reported developing better relationships and feeling more trust and empathy. What can you do about this? Putting your phone away is just the beginning. More important than that is for you to start taking the art of conversation seriously. If you have a bad conversation, it's common to impulsively blame the other person for not being interesting enough. Definitely stop doing that. Instead, if you can take the responsibility for shaping an interesting conversation yourself, you'll be amazed at the results.
Blink 2 of 7.
Do you shy away from difficult conversations? Many people do. But sometimes conversations that look impossibly difficult can turn out surprisingly well. Take the case of Zernona Clayton, who was born in the 1930s and became involved in the U.S. civil rights movement. She also worked as head of a city planning program in Atlanta, Georgia, where one of her colleagues was a man named Calvin Craig, a prominent member of the Ku Klux Klan. Although Clayton knew this, she and Craig still had to build a professional relationship. And while things started frostily, over time they formed a bond, with Craig often stopping by Clayton's office saying she was fun to talk to. Eventually, in 1968, Craig left the KKK, directly attributing his conversion to the relationship he and Clayton had built.
The key message here is, look for common ground, and you'll find you can take on even the toughest conversations.
Talking without judgment is hard. But the story of Clayton and Craig illustrates that you can always find things to talk about, even to people with radically opposing views. Especially these days, in our sharply polarized world, it's easy to assume that you have nothing to say to your ideological opponents. But it's worth trying to cross the divide. Everyone has prejudices, even if they don't overtly harbor racial ones. Consider, for instance, that your child is going to sleep over at a friend's house and you're chatting to the other child's parent. You might find that you agree on various political issues, but does that mean your child will be safe in their house? We tend to assume that agreement on one issue means agreement on everything. Similarly, disagreement on one thing can lead us to assume disagreement on everything. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. Whoever you're talking to, it's most important to show respect and commit to the conversation. Listen to what the other person has to say, and try to empathize with their views. Xernona Clayton changed Calvin Craig's mind not through forceful persuasion, but by being a fun conversational partner. Of course, not every conversation has to end in tearful reconciliation and a bond of eternal friendship. Disagreement is fine, but you do have to listen. As you'll see in the next blink, you might well hear something that surprises you.
Blink 3 of 7.
The author hosts a radio show on which she's interviewed countless guests. But even she makes mistakes in conversation from time to time. Once, for example, a devastated friend turned to her for consolation after losing her father. The author's response was to relate her own experience of bereavement. Her father had died when she was just 9 months old. But doing this upset her friend even more. "You win," she said. At least she'd had a relationship with her father. Of course, that wasn't what the author had meant, but looking back, she realized she'd geared all talk away from her friend and toward herself.
The key message here is, don't assume you know what other people are going through.
It's something that many of us do all the time, often unconsciously. The sociologist Charles Derber calls it conversational narcissism. For Derber, there are 2 types of response in a conversation: the shift response and the support response. Despite her good intentions, the author had given a classic shift response. Even just saying "me too" is a shift response because it moves the focus from the other person onto yourself. If a friend tells you they're busy, it might feel natural to say, "So am I." But the alternative, a support response, keeps the focus on them. Ask your friend why they're busy. What's on their schedule at the moment? Responding in this way is harder than it sounds. It's natural to project your own experiences onto other people. In fact, that's how empathy works. If someone describes a delicious meal, you picture yourself eating that meal too. The problem is that sometimes your life doesn't map to someone else's. Imagine that you recently cut your finger with a knife and had to go to the hospital. When a friend tells you that she cut her finger in a similar way last night, you'll immediately revert to your own experience, even if your friend's injury was minor. When the subject is a weighty one, like bereavement, it can become a serious issue. It's okay to have a different knowledge base from other people. Far too often, we pretend to know what someone is talking about when we have no idea. Simply admitting what you don't know might feel embarrassing, but it's often a great first step in building trust.
Blink 4 of 7.
If you want a friend or colleague to open up in conversation, one of the best things to do is to consider the sorts of questions you ask them. You might think that the best way to extract a long, detailed answer is to ask a long, detailed question. But it's not. The most effective way to encourage a full response is to use one of 6 short words: who, what, where, when, why, or how. Questions that use these words are open-ended. You can't simply respond yes or no and are forced to think through a fuller answer. It's a technique favored by journalists, but it works a treat for anyone. Of course, that's not the only thing you have to do.
The key message here is, you can get people to talk by asking open-ended questions, but the true power lies in listening to what they say.
Say you're interviewing someone who's just witnessed a tornado. If you ask them a question like, "Were you scared?" they'll probably say yes, and that'll be the end of it. So go open-ended. Ask what it was like to be so close to a tornado. Ask them what they heard or how it felt. Let them put the experience into their own words. It helps to be unafraid of silence. So many of us impulsively fill silences. But a slight pause can often be a sign that people are listening. Taking a moment to gather your thoughts is a great way to propel a conversation in an interesting direction. You also need to watch out for wool gathering. In other words, letting your mind drift off and away from what the other person is saying, like wandering around a field gathering bits of wool from the bushes without any sense of purpose. Truly listening is rare. Often, you end up wool gathering even while trying to engage. For instance, if you're thinking about what to say next while the other person is talking. If you do that, you're not listening anymore. Far better to focus on what someone is saying in the moment and let the conversation flow. Ultimately, if you can invest fully in your conversations, you'll find that you stop wool gathering altogether, and that you're asking the best, most interesting, open-ended questions. That's because you'll be listening properly, something we'll take a closer look at in the next blink.
Blink 5 of 7.
A recent scientific study looked at what happens in the brain when people talk about themselves. It discovered something intriguing. When you talk about yourself, the same part of the brain lights up as when you eat sugar, take cocaine, or have sex. It seems that talking about yourself is that pleasurable. Listening, on the other hand, not so much. In fact, it's genuinely hard work. And if you think it simply involves not talking for a while, you're mistaken. It's a skill of its own. But here's the good news. It's a skill that can be learned.
The key message here is, listening is an active, not a passive skill, and you're probably not very good at it.
Most people consider themselves good listeners, but there's reason to be doubtful. Not least because modern technology offers endless distractions. Have you ever found yourself idly checking emails on your smartphone during a meeting? Don't kid yourself that you're multitasking. It's impossible to pay attention to two things at once. You're just distracted. Active listening isn't something that many people do naturally, but through practice you can improve. The first thing you need to know is that people communicate through more than just words. Gestures are rich with meaning, and so is tone of voice. Consider these things and you'll start to develop a deeper understanding of what someone is actually trying to communicate. Here's another technique. Rather than worry about your next comment in a conversation, try and work out what the other person is going to say. Or how about trying to summarize what they're saying, in your head, of course, as a way to focus your attention. The author's own lightbulb moment came when she considered opera. Coming from a musical family, she was exposed to a lot of opera as a child. But she didn't truly listen to it until years later, when she had to learn an aria for an audition and was forced to engage in a more practical way. Suddenly, she realized what all the fuss was about. It's the same with listening to people. It's harder than it sounds, and it does require your active participation. But boy, is it worth the effort.
Blink 6 of 7.
The power of listening well is one thing, but listening is only one half of any conversation. Even if you're paying close attention to what the other person is saying, there's no getting around it. At some point, you're gonna have to speak too. How do you make sure your contributions to a conversation are good ones? Put yourself in your listener's shoes and consider how you sound to them. These 3 tips can help. First, be brief. Second, don't repeat yourself. And third, avoid shaggy dogs. We'll get to that one in a minute.
The key message here is, When you're talking, be sensitive to the listener.
On public radio, most interviews last little more than 5 minutes. They might seem longer because a good interview will be full of interesting information, but the truth is it usually takes longer to heat a frozen pizza. There's good reason for this. We have short attention spans. If you believe one study, the average human attention span is 1 second shorter than that of a goldfish. And sure, that's something we can all try to improve. But the fact remains, if you go on too long, people will get distracted. Watch your partner while you're talking. Do they keep looking away? Do they try to hurry your story along? Think of conversation like a game of catch. If your partner isn't ready to receive the ball, there's no point throwing it. Similarly, don't be lured into thinking that repeating the same point makes it more memorable. Research shows that while repetition helps the speaker remember things, it does nothing for the listener. In fact, if you repeat yourself too many times, the other person will likely just tune you out. Last but not least, don't tell shaggy dog stories. That's when you elaborate every tiny thing so much that the listener loses the story's thread. It's common to think that if you really want someone to remember something, you should go into great detail, but in fact, too much is distracting. Think about that game of catch again. Imagine you want your partner to catch one specific ball. Would it help if you threw a bunch of different balls at the same time? Unlikely. In trying to catch everything, they'd end up missing the lot.
Blink 7 of 7.
Being a radio host means that talking to people is part of the author's job. But that doesn't mean she's always on. In fact, when she gets home from work, if there are people she needs to talk to for administrative tasks, she often asks her son to do it for her. Is she being antisocial? Far from it. But she knows her limits. Truly rewarding conversation requires effort. So, if you're not in the right frame of mind, sometimes it's better not to have a conversation at all than to have one you're unprepared for.
The key message here is, having good conversations is hard work, but getting them right benefits everybody.
Not all conversation is equal. A study in 2010 asked students in Arizona to say how happy they felt and mapped their answers against the sorts of conversations they were having. The study found that the happiest students tended to be the more sociable ones, which isn't so surprising. But it also found that the happiest students of all weren't those that talked the most. Rather, it was those that had the most substantive conversations. Turns out it's good to be social, but it's even better to be properly engaged. In other words, when it comes to conversation, small talk doesn't cut it. It's quality, not quantity, that counts. But why is it that conversation is good for you in the first place? In a word, empathy. According to research, empathy is on the decline among young people, which is a real concern. It's empathy that allows us to understand what other people are feeling and forge real connections. Being empathetic and focusing on people other than yourself is good for you in many ways. For example, volunteering for charity work can make you happier and healthier. One study even suggested that people who volunteer regularly tended to live longer. Plus, of course, there are the benefits that empathy has for the person you're talking to, because having a good conversation is about more than just yourself. Learning about other people, what they think, how they feel, why they are who they are, is hard work, but richly rewarding for you both. And it's just a conversation away.
You've just listened to our blinks to We Need to Talk by Celeste Headley.
The key message in these blinks is that talking to each other is one of the things that makes us human, but we don't always prioritize good conversation as much as we should, especially since the rise of technology. To have a good conversation, it's important to give it your full attention, go in with an open mind, and commit to being a good listener. Learn to do it well, and you'll feel happier and become more empathetic. And here's some actionable advice. Have a meaningful conversation. It might sound easy, but there's more to having a good conversation than meets the eye. Next time you have the chance, take the art of the conversation seriously. Really engage with what the other person is trying to tell you. Give support responses rather than shift responses, and think about how their experiences are different from your own. You'll be amazed at what you can learn.
Got feedback? We'd love to hear what you think about our content. Just drop an email to remember@blinkist.com with "We need to talk" as the subject line, and share your thoughts.